Upstream Color is a beautiful movie. I don't just mean beautiful visually, though it certainly is that too. I mean it's beautiful thematically. After watching the movie again on a recent viewing, the movie really struck me hard and I ended up tearing up while thinking back on the movie. This is because the film is crafted all around what seems to be one particular artistic end goal, and what makes this so powerful is that it's not so much an end goal of intellect, but of emotion. Shane Carruth, the director of Upstream Color, is most known for his previous film, Primer. It was his directorial debut and made on a $7,000 budget. That's absurdly low, but what surprised everyone was just how good Primer turned out to be. It was a very heady science fiction film that combined time travel and modern day white collar engineering into a story that feels really believable even as the film slowly starts to unravel into paranoia and ambiguity. Primer is truly a masterpiece, but this video isn't about Primer. Upstream Color I saw in the theater, having already been a big fan of Primer. Upstream Color was also made on an extremely modest budget of $50,000 and was released to a relatively quiet audience. When I saw it in the theater, it was a very small room and there were only two people in the theater who weren't me and my friends. I expected another heady science fiction thriller. I expected it to very much be about the logic and the spectacle of the premise. Instead, it turned out to be a more contemplative, emotionally driven film, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it on first viewing, though I knew I had seen something special. This most recent time was my fourth time watching it, and I guess something finally clicked. Upstream Color is about trauma. This is both true on the literal level and on the thematic level. The film is, quite literally, about a woman and a man who both experience a similar traumatic event in their lives, and through meeting each other and falling in love, they gradually start to piece together what had happened to both of them and try to find a way to overcome the effects of the trauma and move on with their lives. Everything about this film works to the advantage of this major theme by portraying it in such an honest manner. If there is a definitive statement that Upstream Color makes, it's, I know you've had a hard time and the damage has been done and we can't take back what you've lost, but things will be okay and hopefully you'll find some way to live a happy life again. That on its own is an admirable message, but what makes it hit so hard is how so many of the details of the film really help drive home this point in an emotional way rather than in a purely literal way. Normally when I make these videos, I put a spoiler warning in the beginning, or sometimes I just don't even do that, but right now I want to make it very clear that this film is not something I want to spoil for people who haven't seen it yet. It's an easy film to get a hold of, and it's well worth the price, and I really hope that if you haven't seen it, that you'll stop this video now and go see it for yourself before continuing this video. Anyways, on with the analysis. The basic plot of the film is this. Some sort of experimental parasite is developed that, when put inside someone's body, causes them to have a very low level of cognition, such that they become highly impressionable, essentially in a state of hypnosis. Using this parasite, some ambiguous group of people temporarily kidnap a woman, Chris, our main character, and use her highly impressionable state to convince her to take money out of her account and give it to this group of people. The parasite is then extracted from her and put into the body of a piglet, and she goes back to normal, having lost a lot of her money, with it seeming like she herself is the one who took all the money. This situation causes her to lose her high-paying job, at which point she has to get a low-level job at a printing shop. She develops a professional relationship with Jeff, played by the director Shane Carruth, and this professional relationship slowly develops into a romantic relationship. They gradually discover that the two of them have both been wronged by the same group of people using the same experimental parasite, and the two of them gradually try to figure out what happened to them. This eventually leads them to a pig farmer who watches over the various pigs used to extract the experimental parasites. Chris eventually kills the pig farmer, who's known in the film as the Sampler, and frees the various pigs, tracking down all of the people who have been a target of this experiment, and leading them to the pig farm where they each find the pigs that were used in their individual robberies. Chris seems to finally find peace, and then the film ends. The opening scenes with the parasite and Chris being robbed are interesting, because there's clearly a lot of very meticulous thought on the part of the script to make sure that this is sold as a very real event. It's not only clever on the part of the script, but also on part of the characters. The group who engage in the robberies using these parasites seem to have thought out in a very detailed manner how to avoid getting caught. For example, the man robbing Chris says that his head is the same material as the sun, making him impossible to look at, and he also has a lamp facing towards Chris that obscures his face. This is important because while Chris may end up having a fuzzy memory of what happens during the robbery, she may possibly be able to remember his face if she sees it, and so the robber makes a clear attempt to prevent her from being able to recognize him later. One thing that's particularly interesting about the film is the cinematography, editing, and sound design. Because what they do is they really help put you into the perspective of the characters. Not just by letting us see what they see, but by letting us feel what they feel in sometimes overt and sometimes subtle ways. One particular thing is that this film has a really heavy emphasis on the senses, with sight, sound, and touch being emphasized most of all. The cinematography in the robbery scene of the film constantly emphasizes Chris in the picture and de-emphasizes the robber. This does two things. First, it emphasizes Chris's experience in the matter. The film isn't about the robbery itself. It's about the impact that the robbery had on Chris's life. If the cinematography emphasized the robber, that would, in a sense, give power to the robber in the narrative both of the film and of Chris's life. This film isn't a typical revenge film. It's not about empowerment through vengeance. It's about empowerment through overcoming. So placing the cinematography on Chris throughout most of it lets us as viewers go through what she's going through with her. The second thing is that it actually plays with the viewer's memory. After watching this film 4 times, I still only vaguely remember what the robber looks like. Throughout the entire film, the usage of editing, cinematography, and sound design puts the viewer into a position that mimics the experiences of enduring trauma and the resulting psychological issues. By constantly de-emphasizing the robber's face in the scene, we forget what he looks like and only vaguely remember his existence in the same way that Chris very likely experienced the robbery, only semi-consciously and without a face or a name to put to what happened. While the plot is quite literally about an experimental parasite and the trauma that comes from being robbed via this method, this plot point is also used very well in terms of the construction of the film. One of the most difficult things about making art related to trauma is that you risk exploiting the victims of abuse rather than humanizing them. This is why it's very difficult to handle sensitive topics that people have experienced firsthand, such as sexual assault. This plot point allows there to be an emotional and legal violation of the characters without stepping over into experiences that are way too real for trauma victims to handle. Making a film that is extensively a message about surviving trauma would be almost pointless if the film itself would cause viewers to relive trauma in a way that is too intense for them. So turning it into a semi-science fiction plot allows the film to maintain the same emotional weight as before, but without stepping on anyone in the process. The scenes where Jeff and Chris meet and begin to form a relationship are an interesting shift in tone, because the way that the film is edited is still very similar to the robbery scene, but the context is much different. I'll expand on the importance of the editing later, but for now I'd like to say that their relationship is very well done. While watching with a friend of mine, she commented that she didn't like Jeff, and I think this was intentional on the part of the film. We later learned that Jeff experienced the same trauma as Chris, and I think that Jeff's awkwardness in the early scenes of the two together is indicative of how relationships can operate with people who have experienced trauma. They kind of awkwardly fall in love without necessarily having much chemistry. And Jeff is kind of a jerk, and Chris is kind of emotionally distant, and it doesn't really feel natural. But this isn't Hollywood romance. This is two trauma survivors trying to make things work despite having scars. It feels intentionally clunky, like they don't really know how to properly form a connection with another person, but are trying to figure it out regardless. They might not even be any good for each other, but at the very least they both want the comfort of being able to have someone who loves them. Eventually, Jeff reveals that he's been lying about the job he has, and that he actually has a much lower job than he previously claimed. What's most interesting about this is that he says, "I'm lucky to have this job." Earlier in the film, we see Chris say the same thing about her job to Jeff. Through this, the viewer starts to realize they've gone through something similar, but what's more important thematically is that this showcases the difference in psyche. They both went through a similar trauma, but part of the theme of the film is how people process trauma in different ways. Chris decides to be upfront about not having a very decent job, even though she used to have a much better job, while Jeff lies about having a better job, seemingly for fear of being judged as not good enough. Processing what happened to him through denial and lying shows that he doesn't necessarily handle having lost everything in a healthy way. One of the major parts of the film is the pigs that are related to the trauma that the couple experienced. These pigs seem to form some sort of metaphysical connection with the victims of the various robberies in the film. And through this, when Chris's pig gets pregnant, Chris becomes convinced that she herself is pregnant. Through this, she has scans that reveal that, due to the physical damage done via the parasite, she not only isn't pregnant, but can't get pregnant. This is one of the more emotional story beats, and it's very thinly veiled as a metaphor for sexual assault. Having physical damage as a result of assault isn't unheard of, and being incapable of conceiving is one of the more horrifying long-term effects that can happen. As a trans woman, I relate to this more than you might think, given that it's quite literally impossible for me to get pregnant, and so this part hit pretty close to home, admittedly in more ways than one. The scene that really got to me emotionally, and the scene that I think holds the most weight in unveiling what the movie is doing, is the scene where Jeff and Chris start to finally hit it off. We see a montage of dates and little moments between them and hear snippets of conversation. I mentioned before that what the editing is going for is pretty important to the film, and I'm going to talk about that next. But first, I want to talk a little bit about personal experience. For those who don't know, I've experienced trauma related to my childhood. I won't get into details, but a lot of the pain of surviving trauma isn't just about the most obvious effects, like things reminding you of your trauma and your situation being affected by what happened. It also, for me at least, has severely impacted the way that I perceive things in general. For example, memories and time have a different relationship for me than they might have for others. I have issues with dissociation, which means that I have a very frail grasp on living in the moment. As such, there are some things I remember with a picture-perfect memory, while others are a blur. Time becomes almost non-linear, where the present always feels like past, and I sometimes can't distinguish actual memories from things that I imagined having happened to me, or things I imagine may happen in the future. As such, certain things are in my mind while others are just not there, and I have to sort of piece together where my life has been based on incomplete information. This scene of them having romantic moments together is edited very similarly to most other scenes. The setup for the editing of the scenes is that dialogue will sometimes be edited over footage in such a way that we sometimes see the dialogue coming from their mouths, and we sometimes see the dialogue over related footage in voiceover. This disorients the viewer heavily and makes it hard to tell what firmly right now is supposed to be in terms of the plot. We don't know where we are or what's happening. We have incomplete information. In an earlier scene, as Jeff admits his mistakes to Chris, they seem to be jumping from location to location within the editing, while the conversation is incomplete but still feels relatively linear, even though the locations don't necessarily seem to connect in a linear timeline. This disorients the viewer even more, where we can't tell when things are happening or if what we're supposed to be seeing is a literal event or something else entirely. The reason I bring all this up is because the editing mimics my experiences with trauma. The fact that the plot and what is going on is so hazy and so hard to follow is very similar to how trauma messes with your ability to properly be in the moment and to properly recognize both future and past. You may suddenly forget where you were when something happened, or you may remember the place but not the time, or you may remember the time but not the words. Eventually, the actual events of the past become blurred with imagined events, and they all blend together into a nebulous paste of incomplete memories that you can only barely use to keep yourself together. Senses become more important to lived experiences and moments when this happens. You may not be able to remember names or faces, but you can remember exactly how it felt to be in that situation, in that moment in time, both on an emotional level and on a sensory level. This is why I feel like all of the film's obsession with sounds and sights and textures is relevant, because they're sometimes the only thing that can help you feel like you're really in the moment. What makes the scene of Jeff and Chris hitting it off together so harsh for me is that it portrays all of this stuff in such a way that makes it feel past tense. Montage is an editing technique that can condense time down to relevant information, but it's used in a somewhat subversive way here, where montage is used to make it harder to understand what's going on rather than easier. There's a point throughout the entire film of doing this. The way that you frame a scene of dialogue or an important moment in a film is to find a way to make it feel like it's happening right now. By making things a montage, it makes them always feel past tense rather than present tense. To make the point of how trauma can rob you of your own life in a lot of ways, it would make sense to film all of the mundane or negative moments as fleeting. But what really broke me when watching was realizing that the same editing technique is used during the happy, positive moments too. When trying to cope with the effects of trauma, even the good moments are a blur of past with only little snippets that make us feel like we're a part of the present. The scene makes it feel like these were good memories, but memories that we still never get to fully grasp and hold on to. It really helps us feel the way that I think the characters feel, stuck with a fleeting sense of living life. It's one thing to have the bad moments feel glossed over, but to even have the good moments feel that way is pretty heartbreaking, as someone who knows too well how that feels. The scene where Chris asks Jeff to check for a noise in the house somewhere that's been making it impossible for her to sleep, I think is another really powerful scene because it reminds me of a sort of hypersensitivity that can occur when trying to live a normal life while dealing with psychological stress from trauma. Sometimes the discomfort of simply being alive is what drives people insane, and this scene reminds me of how hard it can be to just be a fucking person for a while. It's not, I can't think because this noise is bothering me, it's, I can't think because this noise is reminding me of how hard it is to keep living. That's mostly projection, but emotional instability and being easy to set off has been a thing for me, and that's just what this scene reminded me of. The last 20 minutes are a contemplative exercise in trying to piece together what really happened and really face the nightmare head on. The ending is really hard to make sense of, but I can say this much. The film seems to have a lot of times where it literalizes the metaphor about trauma, such that they take on a near metaphysical quality. The sampler is a composer, and, pardon the pun, could be seen as having orchestrated the wrongdoings that happened to this group of people. And through his treatment of the pigs, he in a sense controls the group of people, in an emotional and psychological sense. The pigs are his, he owns them. But the ending is Chris and Jeff discovering hints as to where their trauma leads, and then trace it back to the source, killing the sampler and taking control of the pigs, or in another sense, shaking off the control that an abuser can have over a victim's life. It's not so much a literal event as much as it is a metaphor where the sampler represents the power that can be held over a trauma survivor through traumatization. He's a looming presence that keeps them from being able to find peace. So in a sense, his death in the film isn't so much about revenge as much as it is about taking control of your life and learning how to move on from a traumatic event. The final scene of the film is Chris and Jeff tracking down all of the people who have been wronged by this parasite and bringing them to the farm to figure out what happened and to keep the pigs with them. The final shot of the film is Chris holding a piglet and seeming happy, finally being at peace with her life. This image seems a bit silly at first, but by the end of the shot, I found myself choking up every time. She can't become pregnant, she can't get her old job back, and she can't get her old life back. But this final shot implies that she's okay with where she is now regardless. That sometimes, despite being hurt and having things fall apart, finding something to hold on to is good enough. I could dissect the film even deeper and get into the actual plot in more detail and try to piece together what exactly happened, but I don't think the film is nearly about the plot as much as it is about the effect on the viewer. I think the film wants to generate empathy. It's not trying to be deep as much as it is trying to be heartfelt. Shane Carruth has done an excellent job with every last detail of the film, and Amy Seimetz, the actress who played Chris, did an absolutely fantastic job. The fact that the character can spend so much of the movie being aloof and awkward and pained and miserable, and then in the last moments pull someone like me to the brink of tears with little more than smiling, shows how much the strength of a performance and the strength of filmmaking can make a film like this much more than just a story. In fact, it really isn't a story so much as it is a feeling, a poem that pulls you into an emotional state. That emotional state isn't just one we can relate to, but one we can learn from. For me, having undergone trauma growing up and still having lingering effects to this day, the film was way too real to even be comfortable. But I feel like each time I watch it, I learn a little bit more about myself, who I've been, and who I should be in the future. I can't speak for people who haven't experienced trauma, but if you watch this film and keep in mind the emotional exercise rather than the intellectual one, I feel like the film can open up a lot of things to learn about what it means to survive trauma. That's it for this video. As I've said before, I have a Twitter and I have a Patreon. Right now, my current plan with my Patreon is to use the money that is donated to me to help fund my college. I'm going to be trying to get a PhD in sociology so that I can get involved in sociology research and teaching as a professor. So if you like my content and want to support my efforts to turn what I do into something a lot more meaningful, feel free to donate to my Patreon, though you're still absolutely free to watch my videos without donating. The links will be in the description, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the comments.